Number 10. The bullet mousetrap. You might have heard me say that and said, what? Which is exactly what I said when I saw a mousetrap that's main killing potential was to fire a lead slug Minuteman style at a small rodent. It is no exaggeration to say that the difference between this mousetrap and a musket is that a musket weighs a little bit more. The mousetrap was loaded just like a traditional musket of the time, with black powder, a lead ball, and even a percussion cap. In all honesty, I'm not sure how you go about defending this mousetrap. Textbook definition of overkill. Also, there's a loaded firearm in the house with a hair trigger that a small rodent could set off by gently grazing it. I like to imagine a fun family game of, do I no longer have a sister, or was that just a mouse, after hearing a small musket fire inside the home. I also had to mention that while the immediate danger of a .32 caliber lead ball finding a new home in your stomach is frightening enough, black powder being black powder is very volatile and produces a lot of energy. Fire hazard. Smokey the fire safety dog does not approve. Number 9. Tea for men. Winding the clock back to the 1800s, you'll find pictures of distinguished ladies and gentlemen. And these distinguished gentlemen have the fullest and thickest mustaches ever grown by man. Much care is needed to maintain such a manly image. So when an established gentleman goes for his morning tea, it would be rather unfortunate to get his mustache wet and ruin his dashing good looks. An invention of the 1800s beckons to solve this issue with the mustache cup. Mustache cups were invented so the chivalrous men of the day didn't ruin their grooming rituals with a cup of Earl Grey tea. The cups had a small porcelain mouthpiece with a smaller hole for drinking, while the main piece would protect the stash. It may sound ridiculous, but it almost looks like a modern travel mug. So maybe they were onto something. Number 8. Nightmare story. I don't know about you guys, but no matter how you present them, dolls are just creepy. Have you ever noticed that when someone has a creepy doll, it's never just one? There's always a bunch of them for some reason. I don't know, I wouldn't want the room to feel safe or welcoming after all. One man in 1871 said, I know, let's make them even creepier by having them move themselves. The creeping doll, as it was called, was a doll-like automaton that had clock-like gears to simulate real human movement, with the addition of hidden wheels underneath to aid in the doll moving across the floor. Because, the last thing I need is this doll creeping into my bed at night. Whew. Number 7. Gee, this cane is heavy. As people began to settle down after imperial monarchies went the way of the dodo bird, it was a good idea in everyone's best interest to limit people carrying weapons. If people didn't have swords, it could make another revolution a little less bloody. But what's that I hear from upper class wealthy people who don't want to listen to the rules that they make? Well, how about concealed and hidden swords? Yep, that's right. Cane swords were a popular fashion accessory in the 19th century. As carrying swords fell out of fashion, royal men needed to take swords with them for self-defense, or so they thought. Even women were concealing these hidden bladed inventions in parasols. However, it was socially unacceptable for a woman to have such possessions, let alone have the ability to know such training. As time went on, the hidden compartments that held blades were replaced with my personal favorite item, a flask. Number 6. Look at all these cool chickens. Let's face it, we all went through our awkward phases in life. And if you didn't live through the early 2000s as a youth, then bands like Linkin Park and My Chemical Romance just don't hit as hard. So when trying to find the weirdest inventions of the 1800s, I felt like closing my bedroom door and playing Green Day as I dye my hair because I'm super serious about how I feel. Why do I feel this teenage angst, you ask? Well, that's because there's rose-tinted glasses for chickens. Yeah, and they're cooler than me. Ugh. Yeah, little tiny eyeglasses for chickens, but they actually have a good use. They were designed to prevent pecking and cannibalizing other chickens. Ooh. The theory goes that if a chicken was wearing rose-tinted glasses, he couldn't distinguish between blood and what wasn't. That way they wouldn't attack each other. Yet another heartwarming comfort from the 1800s. Number 5. I'm coming out of this hole, partner. We enjoy many luxuries in the 21st century. Warm houses, everyday appliances, and the freedom to shout profanities at strangers on the internet you slightly disagree with, but you give them the business anyway because it's been a bad week and you deserve it. But probably what we should all be thankful for is modern medicine. Back in the 1800s, it just wasn't where it is today. A great example of that is safety coffins. A truly grim situation. A medical doctor has declared you dead. Now you are being buried alive. Have no fear, friends, because you had enough money for a safety coffin. The coffin contained a device or means of various designs, which was to alert the living of your mistaken burial and hopeful resurrection. The very rational fear of being buried alive most likely was spun from fiction and news at the time, with the occasional case happening here and there. However, I'm of the opinion it should be a never ever kind of thing. Yeah, no thanks. Number 4. Your bad hair day has just been terminated. Oh, to live in a time of industrial revolution where machines go and go. I'm sure that all this heavy industry won't enable bad practices of corporations and usher in the destruction of our environment. Pfft, no sir! This is the age of machines, and if machines can help with one thing, it most certainly can aid in another. May I introduce you the rotary hairbrush? Why brush your own hair when an overcomplicated machine can do it for you? At the time, it kinda made sense. Machines felt like they were the way of the future. They were kind of right, but at this rate everything in the home would have intricate pulleys or a steam engine attached. Steampunk, anyone? Number 3. Full of air. The Industrial Revolution changed the world, we can't deny that. That can also be said for the steam trains. But what about pneumatic powered trains? Back in the 1800s, a man named Alfred Eli Beach came up with such a design. Prior testing had proven useful enough to build a larger demonstration in New York. So he built a tunnel to test his air-powered train. It only ran a short distance, but the train held 22 people and was controlled by a roots blower nicknamed the Western Tornado. That was also my nickname in high school. Sadly, the project didn't receive much support from the government at the time, and other methods for trains eventually took over. Unfortunate, because it sounds like Alfred Eli Beach was very dedicated to the project, as he put up a very large sum of money to the project. The tunnel that housed the short train line was completed in 58 days. While he did have bigger plans for his train, it kinda just became an amusement for people. It was shortly shut down thereafter. But 58 days, that's pretty quick. I'd like to see that happen in a major city now. No way it's happening. Number 2. Get on my Mongoose, bro. Looking at the Motor Scout, you can see the beginnings of what could be a 4-wheeler. Personally, I think it looks like a Mongoose from Halo, but Mom thinks I play too many games. Designed by F.R. Sims in the late 1890s, it was never really meant for off-road terrain, instead to support infantry on smooth roads. Sims, understanding the annoyance of trying to ride your motorized quad cycle while someone is firing at you, placed a Maxim machine gun on the quad to return fire. Which is strange, because usually these things require a team of soldiers to operate. He also added an iron shield for a little extra protection. It is too bad that the next major conflict would have a lack of usable roads and more trenches than anything else. While it never did see combat, it was somewhat useful, and would later inspire Sims to design the first armored car. Number 1. Bro, trust me. Everyone has a favorite article of clothing. For sports fans out there, it could be a lucky jersey, but back in the 1800s there was an article of clothing no British soldier could be without. The cholera belt. What does a cholera belt do exactly? Well, it helps to prevent cholera. I've got good sources, bro, trust me. The running not-so-scientific theory at the time was that any abdominal issues and sickness was caused by a chilly belly. So simply make your tummy warm and voila, cholera has been prevented. British soldiers in India were often given the belts unaware of the biohazard that was an epidemic. The belts were just flannel that basically wrapped around you. It's a good thing we're not superstitious today and would never buy into such ridiculousness. Hey man, did my order of healing crystals come in? I'm getting some bad voodoo vibes at home lately, man. I totally need to cleanse that space, bro. Number 10. Steel cage match, brother. Okay, so it's the early 1900s and you're living in a rapidly growing city. Towers are popping up everywhere, and that means that there's less space for you and your baby to play in. Only if there was a way my baby could get fresh air and sunshine. Meet the baby cage. Yeah. A small metal cage with a tiny mattress for your baby. The said metal cage is suspended on your windowsill, making the baby suspend multiple stories above ground level. This is just a great idea. The idea behind this terrible idea was that the babies need fresh air and sunshine. Providing them with such was thought to improve their immune system and make them healthier. Besides the fact that the only thing separating your baby from becoming the worst rainfall event of the month was a thin metal cage. This is a prime example of why every product should be thoroughly tested and thought about before selling. Eventually, these did fall out of fashion, but in reality this wasn't that long ago, which is kinda crazy to think about. Number 9. Nuclear time. A lot happened in the 1900s. I mean, a lot. Couple wars here and there, the TV, the car. It was a busy century. A century full of discovery and invention. One such unusual invention was the radium dial, watches and clocks that were painted with luminescent paint, making the numbers and dials glow in the dark. Trouble with this new invention was the paint being used wasn't exactly safe, as it was made from radium. For the Breaking Bad nerds at home, radium is a highly radioactive element, even more so than the legendary uranium. So when a factory of women eager to get to work were told they were going to be painting watches with radioactive paint, do you think anyone asked for PPE? Truth be told, not everything was known about radium as it was only recently discovered, but what's so unusual is what factories told these women how to paint the watches. In order to give the brushes a fine tip, the women were instructed to use their lips to keep the brushes in perfect order, not knowing that day after day they were ingesting a very radioactive element. And in some sense of dark comedy, they sometimes had fun and painted their nails and on each other. I mean, it glowed in the dark, it was glow in the dark paint, it was new, it was cool. Over 50 women would become very sick from painting, and 12 sadly lost their lives. Number 8. I'm ready for my close-up. Ladies, this one's for you. In this day and age with social media, loving your self-image can be tough. There's tons of things that makeup companies and media do to make you want to be the people they want you to be. If you buy said product, of course. Well, I'm here to tell you that you don't need all that. You're gorgeous just the way you are, and lately, honey, you've been slaying it. However, this marketing manipulation isn't new, and in the past, most certainly wasn't very subtle. Introducing the Beauty Micrometer, the latest from How to Horrify People Daily. It was actually invented by the famed beautician Max Factor Sr. Hell of a name. This steel cagey device was placed over a poor woman's head, to then mathematically calculate the flaws that would be adjusted using makeup products. Obviously these are no longer around, and for good reason. I don't even have a joke for that one, that's just weird. Number 7. Back to the Future. During the technological boom of electronics in the 1980s, there was one invention I think is really unusual. Computers, camcorders, and even home video game consoles were becoming commonplace all over the world. People who are familiar with retro Nintendo consoles are familiar with the likes of Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, or Contra. You may even remember a certain gaming accessory involving a laughing dog every time you miss a duck. What 80s kids might not remember is the Konami Laser Scope. Similar to Nintendo's Zapper, but with two key differences. 1. It's a headset instead of a pistol. 2. It's voice controlled, meaning when you come across enemies in game, you have to shout fire to fire in game. The Konami Laser Scope was bold and tried to be ahead of its time, but when taking a good look at it, 1. It makes the user just look ridiculous, and 2. It doesn't work. Reviews for the headset are not favorable and just defeat the purpose of using a headset. Today we have VR headsets that may seem just as ridiculous, but they work, and the use of voice still isn't a primary control used in games today. Number 6. Battleship Woodchip. This is one of my favorites. Okay, hear me out for this one. Back in the 1940s, there was a really super not very fun expensive war happening. Germany, Japan, and Italy needed to go into the timeout corner. But after a while of people trying to put each other in the timeout corner, things were getting super expensive. World War II was fought on all fronts, land, sea, and air. The sea being a key part to the war victory in the beginning of the war. Literally tons of war goods and ships were being sunk by German U-boats every day across the Atlantic. So, in order to cut costs, what if the ships were built out of something cheaper, but just as tough as steel? Concrete, right? Nope, I bet you weren't thinking ice. Or more specifically, sawdust and ice mixed to form pykrete. Testing with pykrete had gone so well that in a super secret general meeting, pykrete was presented, shot at in the meeting, ricocheting a bullet causing another general a flesh wound. Having its defense capabilities proven in the war room, Operation Habakkuk was greenlit, and the Allies were planning on constructing an aircraft carrier made out of ice and sawdust to help thwart the German U-boats. However, this was scrapped, as a boat made of sawdust and ice would really not be much help against a German U-boat. Plus, where do you sleep? Can you cook on there? Way more questions than answers. Number 5. Hello there! Channeling our inner General Grievous, our number 5 spot belongs to the monowheel. Originally designed in the 19th century, it wasn't until the 20th century they slapped a motor on one of these bad boys and did their best escape attempt from Utapau. Sorry, I'm a Star Wars guy. It just looks like the vehicle from the third movie, I can't help myself. In reality, the monocycle is a single-wheeled motorized vehicle where the driver either sits inside the wheel housing or right beside it. Today these vehicles are still around, but really only used for entertainment purposes, as the design does have a few issues. One wheel gives balance issues, there's a visibility issue since, well, you're usually sitting inside the wheel, and an issue called gerbling, which basically means if the driver brakes too hard, the inner ring will overcome its own gravity and the driver will do a full loop, similar to how a gerbil spins around on its wheel. Seeing that would make Monday morning traffic a lot more amusing though, I gotta say. Number 4. Deep breath, my equine friend. World War I was the war to end all wars, except for the 10 major wars that came after it. Noted for being the bloodiest and most destructive conflict at the time, it gave humanity a bunch of cool and exciting inventions, so long as they were not being used on you. One of the worst things to come out of the First World War was the extensive use of trench warfare and chemical weapons, or more specifically chlorine gas. Trench warfare was brutal, not only in its barbaric over-the-top charges into machine gun fire, but also in its living. Trenches had terrible living conditions, and were difficult to take from the enemy. Crossing no man's land was no joke. So, to eliminate the pesky enemies entrenched in their trenches, the very cruel chlorine gas was used, causing nausea, violent coughing, chest pain, and corneal burns, just about everything you'd find on the back of normal medication, right? Gas masks helped when they were available, but unfortunately they were not the only living creatures on the battlefield. This is where our invention comes in. The very depressing invention of the horse gas mask. The idea is the same. Horses need protection too, and since World War I was still a war powered by horses, it was more common than you might think, and a lot of our equine friends perished alongside us. Number 3. Wilson! Some of you may have been cool enough back in 1975 to own a pet rock. Some of you may have not. Looking back, it doesn't really make any sense. Sure, everyone needs something to keep them company. Tom Hanks would have never gotten off the island he was stranded on if it wasn't for Wilson. Imagine a world without Tom Hanks. I, for one, would not want to live in such a world. All jokes aside, the pet rock was a genius marketing campaign, very similar to the fidget spinner of recent years. It's proof that if you can get a fad trade rolling, you can sell anything. Now who wants some of my bathwater? Number 2. Chef's Kiss. Okay, it's 1958. Times are good. Cars have cool fins on them, Elvis is on the radio, and most of my post-traumatic stress disorder has cleared up since the war was over. It's all great. Ah yes, life is good. I can't wait to enjoy some modern cuisine. Well, let's see what's on the menu. I'll have to start with the frozen cheese salad. I'll have ham and banana hollandaise. And for dessert, I'll have the lime jello tuna pie. If that doesn't sound appetizing, I don't know what does. For some reason, halfway through the century, people just lost their taste buds. They were coming up with all kinds of disgusting foods. A lot of them are in low form for some strange reason. I think the grossest item that you can come across is a little invention called hongar. Sounds like somebody from Skyrim, but nay good sir. Hongar is a mixture of honey and apple cider vinegar. It was thought to provide great health benefits. The only thing that would give me is a spot in front of the toilet refunding my breakfast. Ugh. Number 1. Krümellauf. Germany was having a really hard time in World War II. The United States, Canada, Britain, Australia, France, and Russia too were all coming to give the mustache man a piece of their mind. Heavily outnumbered, it was time for a miracle. Time to see what top German scientists had up their sleeve. We have a rifle that can shoot around the corners. Isn't it wunderbar? Yeah, this thing is real. A curved barrel called a Krümellauf, used for shooting around tight spaces like corners and out of tank hatches. During the waning years of the war, Germany was coming up with all kinds of crazy inventions to turn the tide. But a rifle that can shoot around corners probably isn't the answer. As mentioned above, the world was coming and they needed a lot more than a fancy pants rifle to stop the Allies. History tells us that this invention did not work as Mustache Man is no more. Number 10. The National Razor. What's a revolution without a little blood being spilt? Wouldn't really be a revolution, would it? France was having a hard time in the 1700s, so they needed a brand new way to get rid of pesky monarchs and anyone who isn't warming up to the revolutionary ideals. And what better way to keep people warm by cleaving their heads from their body? A man named Joseph Ignaz Guillotine suggested that there was a better method for unaliving those who needed to be unalived. A common misconception is that he invented the guillotine, but rather suggested its implementation, where his name would become synonymous with such a terrible device. Basically, you got a wood frame with a hole for your noggin and a large angled blade. Blade drops down from frame and removes the head of state from the governing body, which isn't just a clever joke, as that's what happened to the last king and queen of France. By the time of its invention and the end of its use all the way up into the 1970s, yes, that's right, it was used up until the 70s, thousands of people met their doom to the National Razor. Number 9. Party favors in the sky. When you think of air travel today, you think of lots of space for you and your fellow passengers, meals that are flavorful and affordable. Air travel in 2021 is a stress-free, very organized way to travel. But in the 1700s, these luxuries of the sky were non-existent, as there was no air travel. Any international travel was done by ship, which took months at a time and was not a pleasurable experience, opposite to what was described above. Two French brothers wanted to change this, or rather just get off the ground. The two French brothers, Montgolfier, developed and flew the first unmanned hot air balloon on September 19, 1783. This was shortly followed up with a manned flight by Jean-François Pilote de Rosier. This was a very strange invention at the time, as this was really the beginning of humans and flight. Number 8. Puckle needs his gat. Ever since black powder first made it to Europe and Europeans figured out you could make big gun that go boom, people have been trying to come up with better and faster ways to make gun go boom. In the 1700s, the biggest issue with muskets and cannons at the time was reloading, or getting multiple shots off. Loading black powder weapons isn't easy. I'd say ask a pirate, but you can't. Those kind of pirates are all gone now. So to fix the issue of the day, a man named James Puckle invented the very cleverly named Puckle gun. Basically, he just added more chambers of shot rotating around one barrel. Although his idea for the time was genius, in practice it wasn't very effective, as flintlock and black powder are really the main issue. Clumsy, lots of smoke, and does not want to work in less than fair weather conditions. Number 7. Cotton Eye Joe. Dear YouTube gods, I am sorry that history is full of not so cool things, but here at Bumblebee, I'm the queen bee, and I'm here to give the buzz to my sweet honeybees. So in the name of good morals, monetization, and not getting smited, I'm gonna talk about your least favorite S word. Back in the 1700s, America was chillin'. They just beat Britain in a war, which alone could be its own video. They were starting to build their own country, particularly in these southern colonies, using forced unpaid labor that you can't leave. Oh, and your boss can do heinous things to you because he owns you. Their economy was agricultural based and stayed that way for a long time. Tobacco being the #1 crop at first, cotton was still grown but wasn't as popular due to the processing of cotton being a very labor intensive and difficult process. This was until Eli Whitney's cotton gin, invented in 1794. The cotton gin was a machine that quickly removed seeds and processed cotton, making cotton a very valuable crop since, you know, the people harvesting the cotton are YouTube's least favorite S word. It's a brutal unpaid workforce. Now that it was profitable, cotton boomed and the South became very wealthy. While not exactly the main reason, the South getting rich off Whitney's design and did somewhat create a divide between the southern states and the northern states, eventually leading to the Civil War. Also, apparently plantation owners didn't pay Eli for his machine and he went broke. Just trashy behavior all around, man, come on. Number 6. Yes, I'm a Russian submarine commander. I actually couldn't believe this one myself, but the submarine was invented in the 1700s. Having designs and plans started in the 1500s, the first real use of a submersible vessel wasn't until 1775, named the Turtle, an acorn-shaped vessel with a crew of just 1. To me, it's just hard to think that in the same century we were beginning to master flight and sea travel. I also can't stop thinking that if there was a water ride that existed, it would be pretty cool if you went underwater in like a pod, like a submarine kind of thing. Just an idea for the mouse and the corporation. Of course, it wouldn't be years until after the Turtle that the submarine would see effective use. Or have a Scottish man play a Russian submarine commander in a really good movie. Russian submarine commander. Number 5. Dawn of the punch card. With the Industrial Revolution on the horizon, many things were about to change. Probably the most obvious at the time was factories. While not the first, Richard Arkwright's Cromford Mill in 1771 is what most resembles a modern factory today. Cromford Mill was the first water-powered cotton spinning mill and initially employed 200 workers. It ran day and night with 2 12-hour work shifts, the gates being locked at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., permitting no late arrivals. Oh, he likes to keep a tight schedule. Yeah, I can see the beginnings of a modern factory, alright. All you're missing is Bezos and a couple of drones to make it modern. All jokes aside though, these early factories changed the very fabric of not only Britain, but also the world. I mean, where would we be today with all that lovely pollution and those great and fair working conditions? I bet there was benefits too. Number 4. The golden liquid. You drink liquid and then it's gonna come out of you. It's simple, it's science. But sometimes other fluids need to be drained. Sometimes you can have difficulty using the little boys room. Personally, I'm still learning how to put down the toilet seat. I haven't quite figured that one out. How to make pee when a person cannot pee. Portly founding father Benjamin Franklin thought to himself as he was holding a kite in the rain. This is something I learned, which I didn't know, is that he invented the flexible catheter. Yep. Next time you feel a little weird because a tube is being inserted into a sensitive area, you can thank the man on the $100 bill. Invented in 1752 in order to aid his brother with bladder stones. It's strange though, you think of a guy inventing other things, but in reality, it's a really important invention and something that's very common in the medical world today. I just hope to stay healthy long enough so no tube has to go near my founding father. Number 3. Pseudo-cool. Okay, so back in the 1700s, food was really hard to keep. For example, meat is packed with a salty brine in order to preserve it. It either has to be shipped overseas or last long enough through a cold and brutal winter. But plans for refrigeration were being drawn up, specifically the idea of vapor compression refrigeration. Not exactly the fridge that's in your kitchen today, considering there's still no main harnessing of electricity, which makes fridges run, but a brilliant idea nonetheless. While the fridge we know was still far away, it's crazy to think in the 1700s we had serious plans for one. While this was being developed, food was kept near lakes and snows in the winter. Runoffs from mountains were often used to keep drinks cool. I think this is something we all take for granted. I mean, can you imagine drinking room temperature milk or having a beef dinner that tastes saltier than salt? Looking back through history, it's interesting to see how humans persevere. As much as I love food, I don't know if I could stomach food from the past. Thank goodness we don't eat anything gross today. Hey man, do you have any canned cheese left? I'm kinda hungry. Number 2. Ebony, ivory, living together in harmony. I honestly thought this one was older than the 1700s, but hey, here we are, invented in the year 1700 by a musically inclined Italian gentleman named Bartolomeo Cristofori. Unhappy with what was going on at the time, he decided to spice it up by changing out a few parts of some common instruments. And started using little hammers that strike quickly on chords and come back in hopes they would not dampen the sound. A little fine tuning here and there and bada bing bada boom, you got a piano. I would attempt to make a joke about the piano, but let's be honest, no piano, no Elton John. No jazz, no Frank Sinatra. If you're asking me, that's a big problem. Number 1. ABCs. As someone who struggles with reading, this one makes me want to hide under my covers at night. I spent countless hours as a kid learning to read, and man, the phonics lessons were brutal. And thanks to this invention, I can blame it all on the 1755 invention, the English dictionary. Yep, that's right. One of the most influential too. Written by Samuel Johnson, it took 7 years to compile all the words I can't pronounce. He was commissioned 1,500 guineas for the project, which is worth about £250,000 today. Until the completion of the Oxford Dictionary 173 years later, Johnson's dictionary is considered to be the preeminent English dictionary and a huge achievement in scholarship. I mean, you gotta give the guy credit for writing this. Imagine writing an English essay for 7 years. But then again, £250,000 for some of my writing also sounds pretty good. All I have to do now is learn to read and write.
Kicking things off for us here at number 10, we have the human-pig hybrid. This chimera really does exist, and it was created by scientists in the United States. Researchers in the US were able to successfully create the first human-pig hybrid embryo. This was done by growing human cells inside of an early stage pig embryo, making them an interspecies chimera. There were more than 150 successfully created chimeras who had the precursors of organs like the heart and liver, which contain human DNA. This whole experiment was done as a sort of proof of concept to prove that human-pig hybrids are possible. This is all done so that in the future there can be a viable way of growing organs in labs to be used for transplant purposes. When speaking out about this insane experiment, one of the researchers on this project said, quote, "Our findings may offer hope for advancing science and medicine by providing an unprecedented ability to study early embryo development and organ formation, as well as a potential new avenue for medical therapies. We have shown that a precisely targeted technology can allow organisms from one species to produce a specific organ composed of cells from another species." End quote. Do you think that this could be the real future of medicine, or are we pushing the boundaries of medical science too far? Tell me about it down in the comments. At number 9, human monkey. On the topic of other human hybrid embryos, we have another one that was recently created in a lab that is a chimera of a human and a monkey. Much like the human pig hybrid that I just talked about, this human monkey experiment was also designed as part of the scientists' organ transplant research. An international team of researchers added human stem cells to monkey embryos to create this hybrid. This is the first time anything like this has been successful. In the past, people have tried to make what they call human-Zs, which are human-monkey hybrids, but none of those experiments were actually successful. The researchers on this project published their findings and assured people that they were not trying to create full-grown chimeras. It was again just a proof of concept. After 20 days of observation of these embryos, all samples were destroyed, so don't worry, mutant King Kongs are not on the horizon. Now before I carry on with the video, I want to first take a moment to ask you guys to consider leaving a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and also consider subscribing to the channel as well. We have a lot of fun over here on Bumblebee, so smash the subscribe button and join the hive. At number 8, mermaid. Next up, we're talking about mermaids. For years, people have been fascinated by the idea of mermaids. Half fish, half human creatures who live in the water and tempt sailors out in the open sea. When you think about these creatures, the first thing that might pop into your head could be the Disney princess Ariel from The Little Mermaid. Well, what if I told you that Ariel could actually be real? Now, of course, there's no scientific proof that mermaids really do exist, because if there were, we would have seen them in a museum by now, but there is still a chance that they could be out there. These magical aquatic half-humans first appeared in our beliefs 30,000 years ago when they were depicted in cave paintings. Maybe the early humans who created those paintings actually encountered them. We just don't know. If they exist, there is a possibility that they could have gone extinct, or maybe they live in a remote place in our world's oceans that we have yet to explore. Remember, 90% of the world's oceans haven't been explored yet, so you really don't know what's lurking in the depths of the water. These cave paintings that depict mermaids though have me wondering if our early ancestors were actually onto something or not. Only time will tell. At number 7, human chimeras. Here's another human hybrid that actually really does exist, and it's not even that hard to find either. Human chimeras are human hybrids with 2 different sets of human DNA. How does that happen, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. There are a few ways that you can become a human chimera. One way is from getting a bone marrow transplant. When you receive a donor's bone marrow, those cells continue making that person's DNA, and since it's in your body, you start to receive a mix of DNA and can become a chimera that way. Another way that it's done is in utero. If someone is pregnant with twins and one twin passes away in the early stages of pregnancy, there is a chance that the surviving fetus can absorb the cells from its sibling and retain both their own DNA and the DNA of their sibling as well. One more way that chimerism can happen in pregnancy is when a parent absorbs some of their child's DNA. If some of the fetal cells migrate outside of the uterus, the parent can retain that DNA. Some people call this a pregnancy souvenir, but this phenomenon is known scientifically as microchimerism, and this can actually be pretty common. It's just that most people don't know that it's happened to them. Fascinating stuff. At number 6, human mouse. In another instance of human hybrids in lab testing, we have the human-mouse hybrid. In this experiment done by researchers at the University of Buffalo and the Roswell Park Cancer Institution, they were successfully able to create a human-mouse chimera that had 4% human DNA, which is the highest result that this kind of experiment has seen so far. Researchers injected human stem cells into a mouse embryo and monitored its growth. Scientists were able to find evidence of human cells in the developing liver, brain, eyes, heart, blood, and bone marrow. We're seeing more and more of these kinds of experiments being run all over the world, and though it is for medical research, these experiments are also creating a lot of controversy with people saying that researchers are playing God and going way too far. It only takes one wrong move to create some kind of catastrophe, so let's hope that we don't get some kind of real-life sci-fi film out of this. At number 5, Dragon Man. Now this one might not be a true hybrid, but it is still fascinating, and just the name alone made me want to put it on this list, so here you go. Now even though the name might suggest it, no, this is not a half-man, half-dragon, sorry. But it is the newest member of the Homo genus. This past summer, scientists discovered the skull of a new human species that they've named Homo longi. Longi being the Chinese name for dragon, and dragon being a reference to the location that these remains were found, since they were discovered in the Dragon River region in northeast China. The skull of the Dragon Man dates back 146,000 years, and scientists believe that this new species belongs to another sister group of Homo sapiens, so they're even more closely related to us than Neanderthals. What stunned researchers the most about this incredible find was the size of this being's skull, because it's pretty big for a hominid from this time. This find opened a new avenue of discoveries for scientists, so that's pretty exciting news for anyone who takes an interest in this sort of thing. I mean, with further research, who knows what we could learn from this find? Maybe Homo longi really is a human-dragon hybrid. At number 4, real fawn. This next human hybrid could be a hoax, but maybe it isn't. You just never know. Back in 2016, a farmer made a shocking discovery when one of his goats gave birth. He was expecting the usual baby goat, because Why else wouldn't you expect that? But instead what he got seemed to have been some kind of mythical creature resembling a faun. For those who don't know, a faun is a creature from Roman mythology that is half human, half goat. The farmer said that when this baby goat was born, it looked like it had facial features resembling a human baby, with a small face, nose, and short limbs. The farmer told local news sources that the baby didn't survive long after it was born, and the body was later turned over to veterinary services because what the heck do you do with something that looks like it's straight out of Roman mythology? To this day, no one quite knows what it was, but it could very well have been a human-goat hybrid. At number 3, ancient human hybrid. Back in our talk about ancient humans, we have a pretty cool find that suggests that there were once Denisovan Neanderthal hybrids. We know that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred, but now with the discovery of the Denisovans, we know that both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred with them as well. We knew that Homo sapiens and Denisovans mated because Denisovan DNA has been found in a percentage of the population of native Australians. But now, after finding new bone fragments, scientists believe that Neanderthals and Denisovans created offspring as well. In their findings, researchers looked to extract DNA from bone fragments found at an archaeological site, and the results came back showing that whoever this individual was half Neanderthal, half Denisovan. Pretty neat, right? An ancient human hybrid ready to teach us more about our ancient human relatives. At number 2, human cows. Now this one is almost too bizarre to even believe. Guys, we have human cows. Well, we kind of have human cows. Back in 2009, scientists in Russia and Belarus genetically modified cows and goats to produce human breast milk. Yes, you heard that correctly. That sweet teat juice tastes just like mama used to make when you get it from these cows and goats. Now unfortunately, these scientists weren't able to make the milk 100% human, but they got pretty close, creating 60% human milk instead. Human milk just sounds way too weird. The goal of this whole experiment was to be able to mass produce human breast milk and have it on shelves in grocery stores for people to pick up for their families. I'm not really sure how successful they were at getting breast milk in the supermarket, but if they didn't, they at least have one thing going for them. Apparently, human breast milk makes delicious cheese, so do with that information what you will. And finally, at number 1, Minotaur. If you're at all familiar with Greek mythology, then you may know about the story of the Minotaur. Basically, it's about a half-man, half-bull creature who was locked away in a maze. Everyone thought that this was just a story, but after researchers found a site that matches the story of the Minotaur, some think that this beast could actually be real. The story of the Minotaur took place in Crete, and because this is a real place, archaeologists began their excavation and research in this area and came up with some theories for this site in relation to the Greek legend. One theory is that the capital city from this area is so big and complex that this could have been the quote-unquote maze from the story. There is also a theory that because Crete has so many cave systems, this could also have been interpreted as the maze as well. Because researchers are still trying to piece this story together with the real-life evidence that they've been given, solid answers haven't yet been given, but if they really think that they've started to crack the case on the story of the Minotaur, and since they believe that this maze is real, it could be that this human-bull hybrid could also be real. So maybe, but we might never know.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Bobby, Eddie, and David. When Bobby Shafran was 19 years old, he found out he had a twin, a brother named Eddie. The two were raised separately because they had been adopted at birth into different households. Not too long after finding out about each other, things took an even crazier twist when Bobby and Eddie found out that they had a triplet, another brother named David. What should have been a very joyous reunion for the triplets turned very dark when they began to uncover the truth about what happened and why they had spent all of those years not knowing the others existed. As it turns out, they found out they were forced to be subjects of an experiment they had no idea was taking place. Peter Neubauer was a child psychiatrist who wanted to study nature versus nurture, but decided to do it in this cruel and unethical way. He believed that twins or triplets had a better chance of thriving if they were separated from their twin, and he wanted to prove this by unknowingly separating twins from each other at birth. Luckily, Bobby, Eddie, and David all found each other, and their story is documented in the movie 3 Identical Strangers. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Milgram Experiment. The premise of this experiment was that they took 2 groups of people, one called teachers and one called learners, and they paired them up, one from each group. The pair couldn't see each other, but the teacher would ask the learner a question. If the learner got it wrong, the teacher was then told to give them an electric shock. Every question made the shocks get worse until an eventual fatal shock would be administered. Before the experiment, it was proposed that only 3% of the participants would go all of the way and actually give the fatal shock. But it turned out that under pressure, 65% of the teachers actually gave the lethal dose of electricity to their learner counterparts. Luckily, the students were actually just actors, so no one was truly getting hurt or shocked to death in this experiment, but it honestly is very creepy and very disturbing to see these poor people being pushed so far past their boundaries, and it's kind of unsettling to know the results. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Hoffling Hospital Experiment. This experiment happened all the way back in 1966, in a time where the rules of psychological experiments were a lot more loosey-goosey. Because of this, the nurses that were all a part of this experiment had no idea that they were participants, which nowadays is very, very illegal. Basically, this experiment took place on the night shift. The night nurse would receive a phone call during the shift, and on the other end would be Dr. Smith, who's actually a researcher. He would ask the nurses to check the medicine cabinet to see if they had a drug called astrotin, which was actually a drug that was just made up for this experiment, and it was just a placebo. The astrotin would clearly state the maximum dosage of 10 milligrams, but Dr. Smith would ask the nurses to administer 20 milligrams. They were told that the doctor was in a hurry and he would sign all of the authorization papers as soon as he came in to see the patient later on that night. If the nurse decided to give the patient the drug, they would be breaking 3 rules. They are not allowed to accept instructions over the phone, the dose was double the maximum limit stated on the box, and the medicine itself was unauthorized. It was not on the ward stock list, so it shouldn't be in use at the hospital. Out of the 22 unknowing nurse participants, 21 of them administered the drug. That's insane. This isn't to say that the nurses were bad people or that they were bad at their job, but this experiment combined with the interviews that happened afterwards just showed how the power imbalance and the social pressures that come along with that can affect the outcome of a workplace extremely drastically, and in this case it really could have been a matter of life and death. In our number 7 spot today, we have the facial expressions experiment. In 1924, a psychologist with the University of Minnesota, Carney Landis, wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of emotions were the same. Does happiness look the same on everyone? Does sadness, shock, disgust, etc. make us all react the same way facially? An interesting question for sure, but the method was strange. Basically, he recruited some student volunteers and then painted the lines of their facial muscles black. He then exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions and then of course compare the results. This is all fine, except for what the stimuli actually contained. I guess this guy just really wanted big reactions because he included showing them adult films, exposing them to ammonia, making them touch reptiles, and even beheading rats. Apparently, 1/3 of the participants willingly did this beheading when told, despite not knowing how to do it humanely, and even if they did know how to do it humanely, why would you? And for the 2/3 that were regular and did not just behead a rat because a strange man told them to, unfortunately Carney did it for them. I'm not even sure what the results of this experiment were, and I have to ask, does it even matter? What an actual nightmare for something that largely just doesn't really have an impact on our lives. In our number 6 spot today, we have telephone cats. Sorry to all the cat people out there, this one isn't going to be for you. In 1929, 2 scientists at Princeton University wanted to conduct an experiment in order to test how auditory nerves perceive sounds. This is obviously extremely important research, but the way they went about it is very messed up. They took a sedated but alive cat and cut out part of its brain. They then attached one end of a telephone wire to the cat's auditory nerve and the other end to a receiver. When one of these scientists spoke into the cat's ear, the other one could hear it on the other end. This is cool, but most definitely not an excuse to do something so inhumane. There were benefits of this experiment, of course, and it is believed that it may have helped lead to the development of cochlear implants, which is of course an incredibly important scientific advancement. The worst part, however, while the cat actually survived this experiment, instead of treating it like a king for the rest of its life like it truly deserved, these scientists instead killed it to see if the experiment would still work on a dead cat. It didn't. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Pit of Despair. This experiment was conducted by Henry Harlow and is one of the most controversial on this list. In a sort of mental health study, Henry decided to induce depression in monkeys. He took very young monkeys and separated them from their peers and mothers and put them into isolation in a cage that was called the Pit of Despair. Sometimes the monkeys would stay there for longer, more extended periods, and other times they would be repeatedly separated and put into the cage for multiple shorter stays. These monkeys all proved to be extremely psychologically disturbed after the conclusion of this experiment, which should have seemed kind of obvious even before the experiment was conducted. These monkeys were used as a model of human clinical depression, but here's where things get even sadder than they already were. These monkeys were unable to be treated and rehabilitated. Despite various forms of treatment, they were just unable to get to a place they would have been had they not have been subject to a cruel experiment. In our number 4 spot today we have psychic driving. A part of Project MKUltra, this experiment was conducted by British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron, who created the psychic driving concept that the CIA found interesting. Basically, psychic driving was a procedure that subjects patients to a continuous repeated audio loop of something that is intended to change their behavior. Basically, the patients would be exposed to hundreds of thousands of repetitions of a singular statement through the course of their treatment, and they would also be subjected to paralytic drugs that would subdue them while being exposed to this looped message. Yeah, so the CIA heard about this idea for a treatment and thought, that sounds cool. Then they started sending money to fund Cameron's experiments, but he actually didn't know it was coming from the CIA because they used a front. So Cameron's psychic driving experiments for MKUltra began to take place in Canada. I guess they said that the aim of the experiments were to get rid of or cure someone of schizophrenia by erasing existing memories and reprogramming the psyche. I'm not sure that's how schizophrenia works, but I guess they did. Cameron would subject patients to paralytic drugs and electroconvulsive therapy that was 30 to 40 times the normal power. He would also put the experiment subjects into induced comas while exposing them to the repeated audio. The experiments were mostly conducted on patients who entered the institute from more common problems like anxiety disorders or postpartum depression, and they ended up leaving with permanent effects from his actions. These included things like urinary incontinence, amnesia, being unable to speak. Some people forgot their parents and thought that the interrogators were their parents. It clearly completely altered those who were participating in these horrible and certainly unethical experiments. In our number 3 spot today we have the UCLA schizophrenia experiments. Starting in 1983, UCLA researchers Michael Gitlin and Keith Nocherlin went to great and very unethical lengths to see just how people who were suffering from schizophrenia relapse. Basically, they were trying to figure out if there was a way to predict the relapse or a psychosis episode, and this is definitely important work that deserves attention because it could certainly have real-world benefits, but that does not mean unethical lengths should be reached. Unfortunately, this experiment involved recruiting hundreds of participants who were all being treated for schizophrenia and then taking them off of their medication. This alone has some obvious implications for the health of these people, but to make matters worse, there was no suitable plan in place for when they could return to their medication, and they also just didn't do a good enough job making sure that those participating were protected and safe given their very vulnerable state. Unfortunately, the results were disastrous and proved to be fatal when one of the participants, Antonio La Madrid, ended up taking his own life. In an article from 1994, it also says that the doctors failed to get proper informed consent from the patients as well. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Tuskegee Experiment. In the years between 1932 and 1972, there were 399 black impoverished farmers in Tuskegee, Alabama, who all had syphilis, who were recruited to participate in a free program. They were told that the program would help them treat their ailment, but of course that never happened. This experiment was conducted by people who were trying to see what would happen if the disease went untreated. Instead of treating the men with penicillin, which was the recommended treatment at the time, the men received aspirin and mineral supplements as placebos. And while this experiment was conducted to try and understand what effect the spread of disease has on the body, the unethical considerations of the scientists who conducted it proved to be absolutely fatal and just downright cruel. Out of the 399, 28 of them passed away from the disease directly, 10 passed away from complications related to the disease, 40 spouses became infected, which was then passed on to 19 others at birth whose parents had been infected. This whole situation truly is one of those times where you stop and wonder how these things were ever treated as acceptable, and really just hope that things have changed for the better. In our number 1 spot today, we have Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 conducted some pretty horrifying experiments during World War II that certainly are shocking to anyone who hears about them. The experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was gruesome and just inhumane. Different medical schools and universities provided doctors and other research staff to help conduct these experiments, and they used both prisoners and civilians as the guinea pigs. There were a bunch of different experiments that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them with pathogens such as plague or cholera or anthrax. Others involved vivisection or operations with no anesthesia, putting them in a pressure chamber to see how much a human can withstand before bursting, or even live weapons testing. It is hard to even believe that this was a real thing that happened, and we honestly can't even begin to imagine what those people were forced to face during that time.